In conclusion, then, in verse 1, this passage, there are two times of affliction, and they are contrasts. He's contrasting one with the other. The latter is the messianic affliction, is greater in dimension to that which was inflicted by the series of invasions by the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser in the 8th century BC, which he depopulated the land and deported 2/3 of Israel, the northern kingdom. When 6 of the 9 tribes were taken into captivity, Samaria with 3 remaining tribes survived. But he set the stage for a few years later when his successor Shalimar began to siege on Samaria in 724 BC with Sargon II completely in the overthrow of Samaria and in deportation of the remaining tribes 3 years later in 722 BC. Can you still have, is that still in your head? 722 BC. I can remember all those dates in seminary. Some things just stick. That's what happened in the first grievous time. It could not have been worse, they thought. Isaiah is going to say now, in contrast to that, the second or the more grievous messianic affliction is fulfilled spiritually when Jesus struck the area with a rod of his mouth. Although there are some possible literal applications, because Jesus uttered woes against 3 of the cities, Capernaum, Bethsaida, and so forth, and these either he inhabited in ruins or they cannot even be found at all. So there are 3 cities that Jesus proclaimed woe, and they don't exist anymore. So with the word of his mouth, Jesus could speak the words of his mouth and say, "That's no more. That city's not going to be no more," and they can't find the cities. When God decides he wants to open his mouth against somebody with his mouth, he can see that it happens. There were cities that came under continued places. So now notice it says that God says it is not to be compared with that which is inflicted by the Messiah. When God inflicts his anger or his wrath on people, is not to be compared to what the Tiglath-Pileser did to the Assyrians. I mean to Syria. Verse 2. The people that, verse 2, verse 2, you have verse 2, Richard? 9 verse 2. Isaiah chapter 9 verse 2.
People that walked in the darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shone.
The people that walk in darkness. Verse 2 is a parenthesis, which is attached to the latter, or the second affliction, and is so interpreted as much as in Matthew. What is primarily spoken about in these chapters is the intimate. What we're seeing in the chapters that we've been studying is the intimate Assyrian invasion and the total annihilation of the kingdom of Israel of the 8th century BC. Thus, the contrast of the second and more serious affliction of a future is a parenthesis in the main discourse, with elements of the contrast are continued. So, verses 3 through verse 5 refers to Yahweh used of the Syrians to punish Israel, but to place it in contrast is that the messianic affliction of Emmanuel, which is one of fire. The switch from the first to the second is the last part of verse 5 below. Notice verse 3. You have multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. They joy before you like the joy in harvest, and as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Notice verse 3. You have multiplied the nation. The Assyrians increased its borders with cruel bloodshed. Yes, they gained land. Yes, they got the land that they desired to have. But they did it with bloodshed. They wanted to increase their borders, but they did it with bloodshed and not increase the joy. Those conquered had extreme anguish. They joyed before you your own troops, like the joy in harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil, because they had won so much that they still had no joy of trying to divide the spoil by all the destruction that was taking place. Verse 4, for you have broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, the sepulchre of his oppressor, as in the days of Midian. Look at verse 4. His oppressed. The preposition and pronoun which follows oppressed is not of his. Notice it says of his, in that verse, of his, as translated in King James, but rather with it or by it. It is amazing that we look at small words and we misunderstand what they mean. Of his, as translated, but rather with it or by it. The word, so what it is the meaning in the Old Testament is that it means that it was against him or upon them or among them. So the word oppressed in Hebrew is a participle which is a variable cognitive. And as last week Cherry said, I know you're shaking your head, aren't you? Okay. She said, I had to really think last week. So some weeks I'll make you think, some weeks I'll make you cry. So what I'm trying to say is, in other words, to get an interpretation of the text, you have to understand what Isaiah is trying to say. You'll never understand Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, and most preachers preach 6 and 7 out of context that has nothing to do with what Isaiah was trying to say. What Isaiah was trying to say to Israel is, if you think that the onslaught of the Syrians coming against Israel and destroy Israel is bad, it's only a light affliction compared to the heavy affliction that the Messiah is going to bring on the people in Galilee when he shows up. It's a contrast. And I've never heard a sermon on Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 in the context that Isaiah was laying out to make it mean what we were saying. And thus, it is an action word, and this verse speaks of the destruction of Israel's power by the Assyrians, who have broken his yoke of servitude and his tribal signia, and the ruling sepulchre by which he oppressed. Notice, here's another contrast. So how bad is the destruction? Look with me, if you will, to Judges chapter 7 and verse 28. Judges chapter 7 and 28. Bill, can you find that? Jimmy, can you find that?
Yeah.
Somewhere in the historical books. Oh, you know where it is?
With that.
Okay. Yeah, wait a minute. So that it is not speaking of Emmanuel's protection of Israel, but the Assyrians' overthrow of Israel, which is final, complete, and absolute. So Isaiah says the destruction that is coming against you, and he gives a comparison. How complete is the destruction going to be? And he uses, as it was with Midian. Look at Isaiah, Judges 7 and verse 28. 7:28.
25.
Day is done.
25.
Judges?
25.
Oh, you had Judges?
No wonder you didn't think Jimmy could find it.
Nobody can find it.
Promise you, don't do it.
It was a type O. I don't know what verse. Got to have a little sense of humor in this deal.
What is it supposed to be about?
What's it supposed to be
I
about?
think it's 23.
What's 23 say?
And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali and out of Asher and out of Manasseh and pursued after the Midianites.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I want to say. Go ahead.
23.
And is that the last verse?
Nope.
What else does it say?
Gideon sent out messengers.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead and read it. Sorry.
And Gideon sent messengers throughout. You want me to go back and read 23 completely?
Yes.
The men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali and out of Asher and out of Manasseh and pursued after the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites and make before them the waters unto Bethlehem in Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. And they took 2 princes. Is that the one you want that too?
Are you in 25?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read 25.
And they took 2 princes of the Midianites, Orah and Zeb, and they slew Orah upon the rock. Orah and Zeb they slew at the winepress at Zeb, and pursued Midian, and brought the heads of Orah and Zeb to Gideon on the other side this morning.
The key is how it was a total destruction. Gideon went in and totally destroyed the city. Annihilated the city. Isaiah must have read Judges. He must have read the book of Judges somewhere, inspired, and he understood that when Gideon went in, they went in and totally annihilated and destroyed the city. And Isaiah is telling Israel that that's exactly what's going to happen to you. And so verse 3 through the first part of verse 5 describes the Assyrians' assault on Israel and their complete control. So the figure used to illustrate the decree of defeat is a complete rout of all the forces of Midian under Gideon when the Mennonites were completely defeated and the kings were taken and killed. So Isaiah is illustrating, by contrast, what happened under Judge Gideon. So then, and that is what Assyria did to Israel, and that is what is described here. And the same figure is used of Assyria's future downfall in chapter 10 and verse 26, which Isaiah said will parallel in many ways the destruction of Israel, particularly in the suddenness with which they will suffer extension, the same degree as the 10 tribes. So in chapter 10 and verse 26 of Isaiah, God says the same thing that the Assyrians did to Israel, God's going to do the same thing to the Assyrians. So sometimes God uses bad people to punish His people. And then He turns around and does the same thing to the bad people that the bad people did to Israel. So God can use wicked nations and wicked people to come against His people as a punishment. But their downfall would not come at the hands of a wiped out Israel. Israel never overthrew the Assyrians, ever. And it is a mistake to apply this figure in this place to a victory for Israel. The figure, the day of Midian, illustrates the completeness and the overthrow of Israel by the Assyrians. So sometimes we miss the point when we say that Isaiah's remarked as confusing array of thoughts instead of a contrast between 2 visitations of the Assyrians and the Messiah in the same region and the same people. So with an obvious reading, I never saw it, that he was talking about 2 different events, but he brought out the first event to illustrate what Jesus is going to do in the second event. He really wants to bring in Christ, but he illustrates the power of God by illustrating how bad it is in the first.